Everybody, hi. So I wanted to have a bit of a discussion about Donald Trump's presidential picks, cabinet, whatever you want to call them. So in fact, I've never commented on this before. So here in Australia, our view, or my view at least, of American politics, and people vary. So there's some people that say whoever's in charge in America doesn't matter to Australia because they're not in charge of Australia. There's other people that view that it's important because they're the most powerful country in the world or they're the most powerful ally, blah, 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 blah. And it sort of depends on your perspective on things. So, to give a bit of a background, Australia's perspective on USA. So, Australia's strongest ally is the United Kingdom, right? Now, possibly also New Zealand. They're really the only two countries that we have an equal relationship with, right? So, we're fair with them, we're happy with them. So, in a sort of a sense, if you can understand it from a familial point of view, New Zealand to Australia, the way Australia views them is a bit like a younger brother. So we don't really like New Zealand, but we sort of like them, sort of like, pat them on the head. Probably a bit like how USA views Canada. USA don't hate Canada, but they're sort of like, pat them on the head. And there's a lot of countries that have that sort of relationship. So we are friends. Now, the United Kingdom is kind of like a parent for Australia. And so we view them as, I mean, they settled Australia, they created Australia as a global nation. Now, I know there were people already living in Australia, but Australia wasn't really, Australia was isolated before that and only had Aboriginal people, and that was pretty much it. Occasionally visitors, but really nobody that was really interacting with them, except for Indonesia, of course, from the north. Now, Australia, Australia's two most important allies. Now, Australia's biggest enemy is Indonesia, right? So they've been trading with Indonesia for at least 10,000 years, possibly as much as 40,000. We are enemies with them. So if Australia were going to be conquered, Indonesia is the worst version of it. They're not the only threat. USA and China are also threats. But USA and China, if either of them invaded Australia, we would not have a war. We would just surrender and say, hey, no worries. It'd be what you call an annexation for either. Now, I think China's more likely than USA, but they're both, if circumstances changed, it would depend because the only reason why China doesn't invade right now, it's not because of USA does not scare China. If China came and invaded invaded Australia, USA wouldn't care. But the only reason China doesn't is because diplomatically it doesn't make sense. So right now, that's no danger. Right now, USA is no danger because again, USA would look bad if they did it. But if things changed so that it would be okay to do it, then it would happen. And so right now, neither of them are possibilities. And Indonesia is more of a possibility. That's why I say it's more of a threat because things would have to change a lot less. But still, Indonesia is no current threat to invade Australia. There was a time when Pauline Hanson was coming into power and that became a threat. So they're the relevant countries to Australia. So you have Indonesia, China, and USA are our enemies. They're not Australia's allies, they're our enemies. But we also maintain relationships with them essentially to stop them from invading. Now, United Kingdom is not an enemy. They will not invade Australia, even though people say, well, they invaded Australia to create it. Mm. Yeah, there's certainly that argument. There's colonisation and all of that, but they are no, they're definitely not going to invade. Now, the other countries that is relevant is Japan. Now, Japan is relevant because Australia export a lot to us to Japan, especially wool. Now, China again is relevant because we import a lot from China. So we get a lot of Chinese goods in Australia, and there's a lot of Australian goods in Japan. So it sort of comes from China to Australia and then from Australia to Japan. But of course, Chinese goods don't follow that route. So obviously, we need to have a good relationship with Japan as well. Now, no other country arguably matters to Australia. They're the only countries that matter to Australia. Canada, we couldn't care less about. Um, Now, USA, again, we care about China because we're importing from them and they're an enemy. USA, we're not importing from, we're not exporting to. We have no economic relationship with them. Their sole relationship with us is as one of the three countries that could conquer us. So, with that respect, their leadership matters to us as much as the leader of China or the leader of Indonesia. People in Australia do not know who the leader of Indonesia is, and the leader of China does not matter to us. So, then why does the leader of USA matter to us? The reality is that they don't. So, I just wanted to get that perspective in there. And this is a global perspective. Again, then we do have other countries that matter a little bit. So Afghanistan matters from the perspective that in the 1850s, Afghanistan and China both came in from the gold rush. Now, Afghanistan supplied Australia's camels. So we have more relationship with China than just as an enemy. There's a lot more, and this is again why China's more likely to invade than USA. We have very little relationship with USA. We started our relationship with USA technically in World War II, not really, in the Vietnam War. And in that case, Australia fought, USA fought, and we kind of became friends over that mutual decision to go to Vietnam. Now, after that, um, Australia became kind of our tool, partially at least, to provide uranium to USA so that they could create their nuclear weapons, and also so that we could have the harsh environments of Australia, particularly our desert where nobody lives, for American soldiers to train so that they could become better equipped, particularly in the Iraq War. And of course, New Zealand broke off their relationship. There was an ANZUS treaty, Australia, New Zealand, US, and New Zealand broke off that just before the Iraq War, 1991, and so more American bases were created in Australia. And so essentially, Australia have been forced to do America's bidding, especially since the Iraq War. So since 1991, we do what we're told. So if you look at from a diplomatic point of view, Australia really didn't want to go to Afghanistan. We really didn't, but America forced us. Now, we probably didn't want to go to Iraq because we have no relationship with Iraq, positive or negative. And we really don't want to get involved in Ukraine. Now, from a historical point of view, Australia do not have really any relationship with Russia or Ukraine. Um, but we're generally negative to both, except that Americans make us suddenly be positive to Ukraine. Now, historically speaking, from an Australian perspective, they're so far away they don't matter. But we also generally have a negative view of those countries because they're Soviet Union and they're Warsaw Pact. So our view in Australia is that Warsaw Pact countries are bad. We don't have positive relationships with any of them. In fact, we don't have positive relationships with Germany either. And the only country that we sort of tolerate here in Australia out of those countries that are historically enemies is Japan. Again, because Japan take a lot of our wool, our sheep. That's our main export to Japan. But even still, we have generally a pretty negative view of Japan. In fact, people in Australia are more positive to China than to Japan. And there's quite a lot of Chinese citizens. Another country we have a bit to do with is India, mainly through cricket. So our mutual love of cricket, we love India. And from that perspective, we also don't mind South Africa, um, even though obviously the whole apartheid and thing is there's different views on that, but it does make it a bit awkward. But there are some positive views of South Africa and also the West Indies. So the Caribbean, the northern part of South America and Central America, we're fairly positive towards. Um, most of Africa, we're not very positive towards. We don't like Africa, most of Africa. Middle East, we really don't like. Uh, we have a reasonably big Jewish population, so Israel, we're fairly positive to. Um, Mexico, we other than having Mexican food, we don't know anything about it. So from that's the whole perspective of Australia, really roughly. And then you look at what currently, so we're well and truly past the Vietnam War. We're past the end of the Cold War that ended in 1991, and we're still being forced to do what America wants us to do, especially since the Iraq War. It's kind of that Iraq War, then Afghanistan, and now the Russian thing sort of have replaced the Cold War. And it's sort of, some people describe it as a new Cold War. So this is sort of the third part of it. So Iraq, Afghanistan, well, I suppose Iraq twice, and then Ukraine and Russia. So I suppose sort of fourth, these are the new Cold War. And we're still being forced to do what America wants us to do. So the view in Australia is we should stay out of it. We do not want to support Ukraine because we don't trust Ukraine, but we also don't want to support Russia because we don't like Russia. So we want to stay out of it. And we've had a cost of living crisis in Australia as a direct result of the sanctions, because the sanctions are actually hurting everyone else but Russia. It's not because of the war directly, because they could have had the war without the sanctions, but it's the sanctions that, because I didn't know we were actually buying all of this Russian oil and gas. And so without being able to buy them, we have to pay top dollar elsewhere, and that affects all of our prices. And so everybody in Australia is suffering, and we're not really speaking out about it because we're not saying why we're suffering. Some people think it's because of the pandemic, and it's not. It's actually because of the sanctions. So in a lot of ways, we are suffering, and even though we don't support that, our view in Australia is it's an internal conflict. Let them deal with it themselves, however they're going to. And maybe you could argue, well, it involves Europe, maybe even America. Certainly doesn't involve us. It doesn't matter to us. But the only reason that it potentially could matter is if it becomes nuclear or it becomes global, let alone if it became both. And that's why it's a problem, because Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. Now, Ukraine don't. They don't have any. But, and you could argue, well, Russia will throw however many nuclear weapons they throw on Ukraine, that's not going to affect Australia. But if there's any retaliation, especially from America, then it will affect Australia. Now, I don't think Russia are likely to nuke Australia because Australia haven't sent very much to Ukraine, but it could affect things. So that's why the appointment of Donald Trump or the election of Donald Trump really matters, because he's going to end that war. Now, assuming he will. He's a politician, politicians lie, he might not. And even though he says he will, he might not be able to. So that's the only reason that it matters. If it wasn't for that, it wouldn't really matter. It'd be sort of a hypothetical. And I said in 2020, I actually was neutral about whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump should get in. I didn't really care either way, because I thought Joe Biden seemed to be pretty good. And I'd say in the early part of his leadership, he was reasonably good. But then, of course, he messed up with the retreat from Afghanistan, and he really messed up the Ukraine war. And I think if you had any other politician in charge, any other president that there's ever been from either side of politics, they would have handled it better. Barack Obama in 2014 handled it by just staying out of it, which I think was quite a sensible way to do it. And I think if Donald Trump had been in charge, he would have been threatening nuclear war, and people would have been scared by it. But I think there wouldn't have even been an invasion. And I think that what you would have had is there would have been a summit, which would have been Ronald Reagan style, like when Ronald Reagan met with Khrushchev. I can't remember who the Soviet leader was at the time, and they met and decided to end their Cold War. And I think that's what would have happened had Trump been in charge. I don't think there would have been an invasion. So a lot of people are saying, "Oh, Trump would have given Ukraine to Russia." I don't think so. I think that Trump would have been very hard on Russia and would have said, "Hey, you invade, we are going to nuke you." And there would have been that threat level, and they would have taken that very seriously and talked about it and not invaded and worked out a different solution. Now, what that different solution would have been, I suspect most likely, would have been that they would have had a binding, neutrally observed vote about the autonomy and right to self-determination of the Donbass, at least, and also would have ratified that Crimea does genuinely believe that they want to be a part of Russia. So the Donbass, of course, they'd already had a referendum, but it wasn't ratified and it wasn't neutrally observed. So you'd send either American observers or you'd send United Nations observers, because Russia very much supports the United Nations. And you couldn't have sent NATO. If you send NATO, it wouldn't be respected. But you could send USA. USA could be considered to be neutral as far as that conflict is concerned. Um, and I know Joe Biden hasn't been neutral, but I think USA as a whole, particularly under Trump, would be considered to be neutral, because I think USA historically hates both Ukraine and Russia equally, and also like them equally. I don't think there's any trust between USA and Ukraine, even now. I know we say, "Oh, Ukraine's so wonderful," but realistically. I don't think there's any real trust there. I think there is genuine hatred against Russia, but I think that hatred is at the same or at least very similar levels against Ukraine. And there's some reasons to hate Ukraine more, such as the Nazism. And I think we've got to be genuine about that, that Ukraine have the softest laws about Nazism anywhere in the world. And I know people talk about Singapore or Malaysia having, stores, but Ukraine go further than that. They have them in their military. They have whole military divisions, and they have political parties. Now, I know we had a little bit of that in Greece, but it's not to that level. It is worse in Ukraine than anywhere else. And Russia are probably the hardest on Nazism out of anywhere in the world, or at least up there. One of the hardest. They execute people. So even though some people slip through and all that, there's that's one thing where there's a distinct difference. Now, I know Russia are worse in other ways, but that is one way where definitely Ukraine are worse. Um, so I don't think there's any love between USA and Ukraine, realistically. Now, I know there's a lot of propaganda, so we pretend there's love, but I think realistically, USA hate both countries. And there's very little trust between them. And, so Zelensky going in there, that's a political maneuver that is not based on a genuine alliance or genuine understanding between the two countries. It just doesn't exist. Be like if Australia went there and said, "Oh, look, we love you, Indonesia. Let's be best friends." We're not going to be. We've got a long time, centuries of distrust. It's not going to happen. So, and again, I said at the start, Indonesia is Australia's biggest enemy. So that's the most important reason why, for the world, why Trump needed to get in. However much you hate him, and I'm sure there will be negatives to his leadership, that is essential because that will stop the war. Now, I saw Joe Biden authorised long-range missiles, which they're allowed to use in Russia, and then Russia said, "Hey, that means we'll be at war with USA." Now, I don't think that Russia will declare war with USA because Russia will say, "Well, we did say that, but then you're going to have Trump in power." So I reckon what will happen from that is that Putin will meet with Trump and say, "Are you going to authorise this?" Trump will say, "No, no. Then Biden will come in and Biden will say, "Oh, no, up." And Putin will go, "Yeah, you did this to hurt Trump, didn't you?" And he say, "Yeah, okay, I did it to hurt Trump." And I don't think that'll escalate to that level because that's realistically what Putin would do, even though he has that threat and he wants to be true to it. And I don't think Biden will drop back down. I've seen this in some other countries. That happened in Australia even when we went suddenly at the last minute, we went to Iraq because what was it? Um, Bob Hawke wanted to hurt Paul Keating. So he's like, "Oh, I'm about to leave office. Oh, let's invade Iraq and we'll join with America." And if Australia hadn't joined with America, and we don't realise this, nobody else had supported America. And so it would have just been America invading Iraq against United Nations, against every country in the world who didn't want it to happen. As soon as Australia went, then Great Britain went, and then the United Kingdom went, and a few other countries went afterwards. But it was Australia that was the big cornerstone for that. So, and that was a political manoeuvre. So this is very much a political manoeuvre, and I think Joe Biden did this to hurt Trump. I think it's pretty transparent. So I don't think that'll escalate. I really don't. I mean, it is a bit of a nasty move. It might not even be approved. And I mean, and it might not make a big difference. It's. I think what'll end up happening is that it'll be used as leverage by Russia. It'll make Russia more powerful, make their position more powerful because America betrayed them in that way, so at least Biden did. And that'll give them a more favourable deal once Trump comes into power. And Trump's even said that he could end the war before he comes into power. I don't think that's possible. And I think this makes sure that it's not possible. But yeah, I'm not seeing that as being a direct war with America suddenly, but I think that it does raise the stakes. Now, I know that it's been a long time, 20 minutes now, talking about my background, but now the appointments. Look at 2016 and then 2017. He didn't have the majority in the Senate. He didn't have the majority in the House of Representatives, or maybe he had one but not the other. I can't remember. He didn't have the majority vote, and because of that, he was forced to take picks that didn't want. Or maybe he just didn't know what he was doing enough, but he ended up with people that were disloyal. Now, not of them were good. But even Mike Pence, his vice president, was disloyal. Have a vice president who's going to stab you in the back. I mean, I know in Australia we had that, but yeah, you can't have it. It's just you're not going to have an effective leadership. And of course, because he had the minority in the House of Representatives, he was able to be impeached. So if he has a majority, you can't be impeached. So impeachment is just a complete flawed process. So because it basically says you have the majority of the House, and you almost always do, you can't be impeached because you need a majority against you to start the impeachment. Now, it's not to say that if you have the minority in the House, you're always going to be impeached, because you usually are not, but you need to have that to start with. So, no matter what Trump does, unless somebody goes against party lines, he's not going to be impeached while they have control of the House. And the Senate, it doesn't even matter that much, it just means passing laws. So, he can pass laws now, he's got majority in both. So, these picks are going to matter. Now, last time he had people that were career politicians who ended up, some of them at least ended up betraying him. This time he's got some people who aren't career politicians. Elon Musk is not a politician. He's a businessman. And there's the guy, the energy, he's not a politician. And I've got a feeling there was someone else as well. But yeah, he's got these people. He's got people that are actual Democrats. So he's got Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., both Democrats, or at least they were at the start of the year. And they're not Republicans now. And Elon Musk is not a Republican. So these are all centrist, centre left. Now, people are calling them far right extreme. Trump isn't a far right extremist. Trump was on the Democrat side several years. Now, I know he spent more time on the Republican side, but he's far from a far right extremist. He's very central. He's a populist. And so having these people from the left of politics will make it more appealing for people from the left. Now, they'll have to, I know that they'll be saying, oh, no, these people are betrayers of the far right, blah, 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 blah. But it's going to help. Now, you might say, what is he doing having a conspiracy theorist who's against health in charge of health? What the hell's going to happen from that? And I would answer that by saying, well, America has one of the worst health systems in the world. Everything's privatized. People who are sick can't afford to pay to go to the emergency room because it costs $10,000 or maybe more just for one visit. And so they just keep it themselves. They're free here. If I'm sick here and I need to go to the emergency room, it's free. If I'm sick, I need to go to the GP, it's free. Now, there is private care you can get if you want to, and it is better, but you at least have your basic public care. They don't have that in America. Now, I know there are circumstances where they allow people to be seen without insurance and without paying and all that, but the whole system is designed for the rich, or at least people who can afford that kind of thing. I mean, I had a heart attack last year, and did I have $10,000 to afford to go there? No. What would have happened if I was in America, had a heart attack? Would I just gone, I'll manage? Well, I mean, it was actually the kind that I wasn't going to die without treatment, but you know, would I have just gone, nah, I can manage? People die from heart attacks if they're not seen. I mean, depending on the type, but you know, it makes a big difference. And the thing is, if Americans come to Australia and they want to see a doctor, they can see it for either free or very cheaply. We can't do that if we go to America. Oh, sorry, bit asthma. But yeah, so I think that, I mean, if he stuffs it up, it's not going to really get worse. America has one of the worst systems in the world. I mean, you might say, oh, but there's parts of Africa. Yeah, parts of Africa have no money. Considering the amount of money they have, it's a terrible system and it needs a major overhaul. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that RFK will be able to fix it. He might not. He might make it worse. If he makes it worse, well, it's not going to be much worse. It's already pretty bad. It's been pretty bad the whole time. Now, I don't know that he will make it public. I don't think that can happen in a 4 year period, but he might be able to improve it in some way, and he might make it worse. He might make it worse. Who knows? Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, you say, well, she's going to be the director of national intelligence. She might mess it up. That's true. America has the most powerful spy network in the world. Now, we know that they lied extensively in Ukraine. CIA on record saying, "Well, we told some great lies, and we won the war of disinformation in Ukraine. Good on them." Now, is that helpful? I mean, look, there's obviously helpfulness by doing spying, but you know, is that the kind of thing that helps, where they've helped to make sure that people believe absolute lies about that? And there's people who would normally be anti-war who are baying for blood, wanting 500,000 people to die, wanting more than that because of these lies told by the CIA. Do you want to rein that in and have them tell the truth? Now, we also know the CIA were involved in election interference in Twitter and Facebook over the Hunter Biden thing in 2020. And, that's been proven. Twitter's accepted that they've proven it. There was the Twitter files. Facebook's accepted it. Mark Zuckerberg went on the Joe Rogan show and said, no, we did it. There's been evidence of this. There's been things have come out. And you go, well, is that really a good use of taxpayer money? I mean, if you're going to be spying, shouldn't it be spying and looking at things that Russia and China are doing and trying to stop it or trying to find out about it? You know, like there was a suspicion that China shot down MH37 or whatever. No, actually, that was MH whichever it won 30, the plane that went down. There was the one that Russia shot. We know that's obvious, but there was the one that was just disappeared, and there was a suspicion that that was actually they were selling secrets to China, and USA shot it down and killed everybody. That was the main claim. So is that what they should be doing? Okay, they want to stop the secrets from getting out, fair enough, but do you want to kill 350 people who have nothing to do with it? And, is that a good use of our money? I mean, could they just say, hey, look, we shot it down, we saved the secrets that these 350 people know nothing about. We've rescued these people. I mean, I don't know. Like, I suppose I can't say that that was definitely the wrong thing to do, assuming they did it. But I think they did. I think that is what happened. And I think America did shoot down those people. Now, do you want to fix up these sort of things? Do you want to have it be a more honest situation? I mean, maybe what they're doing is correct. Maybe what they're doing is the right way to do it. And I mean, Elon Musk being in charge of, or duly in charge, along with Vivek Ramaswamy, of Department of Government Efficiency. Apparently, it's only going to be a temporary thing for 12 months or something. But we'll say, well, he stuffed up Twitter. Did he stuff it up? I never look. I joined Twitter whatever year it was, 2009 or something, and I saw so much cyberbullying there, and it was like I don't go to places with cyberbullying. I've experienced a fair bit of it, and there was so much there that there were people that were dying, like lots of them, and I can give you a number of examples. There was that one from Australia's Next Top Model. She was bullied on Twitter and died. There was that porn star lady, whatever her name was, and there was lots of them. And Twitter were really bad with it. Now, since Elon Musk took over, yes, there's still a bit of cyberbullying, but it's nowhere near the same level. And the people who are engaging in cyberbullying have mostly left because of him. Now, you can talk about transparency and stuff, that's great too, but the cyberbullying has improved dramatically. Now, Facebook, I used to say, was one of the most friendly, safe places, but since 2016 or 2017 at least, it has become a lot less safe. It's still quite safe, but I say since Elon Musk took over Twitter, Twitter's been safer than Facebook. Now, Facebook since then has also become better. So it had a flow on effect. Now, what's that going to do with the Department of Government Efficiency? I mean, I think it's well known that America wastes lots of money on a lot of things that, military is one thing. They, spend billions of dollars, trillions of dollars on different things. But then you say, well, but we need to have that. Okay. Are they doing things that they don't need to be doing? Maybe they are. Maybe not. But yeah, it's a bit. I think that the main thing will end up being military, but I don't know if they will cut back military. It's possible they'll get a bit of pushback on it, But look, I've worked in a lot of places that have had these cutbacks, and I think that it is useful to have that. And I think that, you know, like when we get our tax return in Australia, it says what our tax is spent on. So if my let's say I paid $7,000 tax, it'll say, oh, 1,000's gone to military, 1,000's gone to health, blah blah blah, and it will give a dollar amount, not just a percentage, but an actual dollar amount out of my tax that I've spent in that past year that's gone to these different areas, based on the budget and based on the percentage and all that kind of thing. So I think it would help if America had that, and I think it'd help people to have faith in their government. So I certainly think that's a good thing. What it'll end up doing, I don't know. And I mean, having a guy in charge of border, is that important? I mean, I think it's important for most countries, and not every country, but most countries to protect their borders. Now, obviously, there's countries like Iceland who let anybody in, and I don't think the Netherlands care that much. But if you look at who their neighbours are, they're not really enemies with their neighbours. They're no problem with their neighbours. We have border issues here in Australia because we get people coming from Indonesia who we share a border with, even if it's a maritime border, who are our enemies. So we want to stop people from Indonesia coming in. We don't care if New Zealanders come in, but we do care if Indonesians do. And by the same respect, I think that Americans don't care if Canadians come in, but they do care if Mexicans come in. They probably care if Russians sneak in too, but that's just not happening. So they'd have to come via Alaska and then via Canada, and it'd just be very complicated. Um, but yeah, Mexico's probably not their enemy. It's not the same sort of situation, although Russia is, obviously. But, you have that situation. There's different parts of Africa where they should be protecting their borders, and when they didn't, they had big problems. So I think it is important to protect that, and I think it is important not to ban people coming in, but to make sure that they're the right kind of people, particularly when you're coming from an enemy area. Again, like people coming from New Zealand to Australia, that similar situation to from Canada to USA. I think you could let in almost anybody, and it wouldn't matter because they're not our enemy; they're our friend. And but in the same respect, I think that Mexico, you do have problems, and you do have people that are not your friends. And so I think it does matter which country you're from and the relationship with the country you're going to. And this is not to say that Mexico is objectively evil or that Indonesia is objectively evil, um, so much as they're the enemy of Australia. And I mean, we even care about people coming from Papua New Guinea. We love Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was a part of Australia for 30 years or so, 1950 to 1980 or 1950 something to 1980 something. So we love Papua New Guinea. In fact, we're quite friendly with New Caledonia, Fiji, Vanuatu, and probably Tonga, probably Samoa. I think we could let people in from those countries as well, quite happily, quite easily. But Indonesia is a different issue. Um, I'm not sure what our status is for Philippines and Malaysia and all that. Probably better than it is with Indonesia. Indonesia is a problem for Australia. As I said, they're one of our three enemy countries, three major enemies. And again, the other two are China and USA. And people, USA, what are you talking about? They're an ally. They're not allies. USA to Australia is like the school bully. And it's like we've decided to join the school bullies gang so they don't beat us up. So we're in the school bullies gang, not because we like the school bully, but because we don't want to get beat up. And China is like the school bully of a different bully gang. And we're in the school bullies gang to stop that school bully from beating us up. And if we stop from being friendly with America, we'd have to become friendly with China. Otherwise, they'd both beat us up. So that's the situation. Realistically, America are our enemies. But that, I mean, I got to say that with a sort of asterisk. If Indonesia invaded us, we would have a war, and I don't know who would win. Australia has a much smaller population, and I'm not talking about any allies because I'm assuming nobody will get involved. I don't think they would. If Indonesia come to Australia, well, New Zealand might help, but I don't think they're going to help that much. Australia's population about 26 million. Indonesia's what, 300 million maybe? 10 times differential, but right next door. Wouldn't take much for them to come in. I reckon what would happen is Indonesia would take Darwin and the northern part of Australia pretty quickly. Darwin would be their focus point, but Darwin's pretty tiny. It's like 200,000 people or so. they would be controlled very quickly. And then what I think you'd find, Indonesia would also take Papua New Guinea as well as being our allies, and they'd probably take all the other island nations nearby that are our allies that are pretty easy to fall. So they'd take Fiji, Vanuatu, um, New Caledonia, and I think they'd probably take New Zealand. Now, taking New Zealand would be difficult, but they would try to do that to cut off reinforcements. They would know that USA would not come and help. Except for that probably what USA would do would be airlift out all of their people and say, bye bye, good luck. Maybe leave a few weapons behind for us to use, but that'd be it. So Indonesia would take Darwin, then they'd take those areas, and then they would have the choice of whether to take the big cities, such as Melbourne and Sydney, and possibly Brisbane, or to take the empty areas. And I think most likely what they would do is they would take the empty areas, which is northern Western Australia, northern Queensland, and then going south, stopping probably at about Alice Springs. Now, Alice Springs would have a big battle. I don't know who'd win. Tiny area, but big American base there. So I think even though the Americans, I think, would leave, they would leave all their weapons behind for us to have. And we would probably all focus. So the people from Brisbane and Perth and Sydney and Melbourne would all come to Alice Springs, and with all the weapons, all the fortifications, the big bases and all that, they'd have a big battle. Now, the winner of that battle, I think, would probably win the war. Now, again, 50-50. So I think that you would find that the northern half would go, it'd take 6 months or so to get there. Maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. It's hard, depends on how things go. And then they'd have that battle. Now, if we lose that, then I think they'd take Perth and then Adelaide. So they'd go down through Western Australia, take Perth, they'd hold Alice Springs as their bases, take Perth, then move further east and take Adelaide. And Adelaide and Perth both have over 1 million people. They'd be fairly big battles. They would put up a big fight. Perth's very isolated. They would be easy to take. Then they'd take Adelaide. Meanwhile, the eastern seaboard, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, and also Canberra, our capital city, and also Tasmania would be there. But then you've got the island nations, plus New Zealand probably be gone already if they've been sensible. Then they'll come in. Now, when they come in, there would be a big fight, and I think the big fight would probably be at Canberra. And again, that's the second big battle that you'd have. Now, I think if they've won the first battle, they're probably going to win the second battle, but they still need to win it. So if we win that one, then we go back and try to take Alice Springs, and then you keep going for several years. But if that one fell, and I think at that stage the odds would be against us. If Canberra fell, then you'd probably find Sydney would fall soon afterwards, then probably Brisbane, and then they take Melbourne, and then of course Tasmania. Now Tasmania would be probably the last one to fall, but that doesn't mean that there would be any fights. There'd be a bit of a fight over Sydney, not as much over Brisbane, and Melbourne would be our final stand. Now that war would probably take at least 2.5 years, maybe three. And of course, if we did win the Canberra battle, having lost the Alice Springs one, it could end up being 5 years. And now, again, that's a 50-50 fight. That's how a war with Indonesia would go. We would probably see upwards of 3 or 4 million Australians die, and probably several times that many Indonesians. You could be seeing 50 million Indonesians die in the war. And Indonesia would still win in spite of having bigger casualties because they have a bigger population. Now, I don't expect that there would be major support outside of, well, New Zealand will support us, but outside of New Zealand and those little island nations, which don't really matter. New Zealand will matter a bit, but the others really don't. Um, and I don't think the USA would help, although they would provide some arms, at least initially. But once the corridor was cut off, I don't think they'd be able to. So that's how that war would go on. Now, if China came in, assuming they came in with a big force, I don't see there being a fight. I see there being a negotiation, and there we shake hands and we have a peaceful transfer of power, and there's no war. If USA came in, there would be no war. We wouldn't even have that peaceful transition. It'd be even simpler. So the difference between those three scenarios and why we need to fear Indonesia more. Indonesia, there's less. that has to change for them to invade. We still need a few things to change. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but if you went down a path, it could happen in 2 or 3 years. And for China and USA, we're probably further away. China's probably at least 5 years, and I'm not saying it'll happen in 5 years, but there'd have to be a path for 5 years worth of certain things happening for that to happen. And USA is probably 7 or 8 years, maybe even 10 away from them happening. Um, but at the same time, we do care. We care about all three of those countries, but we worry about what we say. We even worry about what we say about China. Probably worry about them the least, but we don't have anti-Chinese propaganda in Australian TV because we're scared of them. We don't have anti-Indonesian propaganda in Australia. It just does not happen. In fact, we're really scared. We don't even mention how big a threat they really are. Um, so yeah, in all three scenarios, of course, if Indonesia took over, I think we'd still continue to fight even after we were conquered, and we'd probably try to get Australia back after a while, and I probably would be able to eventually. Might take 15, 20 years, but we'd get there. If China or USA took over, it'd be permanent. And in a lot of ways, China and USA, and they may not talk about this very much, but they're really looking at which one of them gets to take Australia first. So, you know, China want it for the land, USA want it for the position. So to have a stranglehold over this area. So, they've got a stranglehold over the Middle East by controlling Israel, and it'd be nice for them. They'd love to control Australia, and yeah, it'd be a little holiday home, much like I mean, having having control of Hawaii doesn't really help them very much, but it's a nice little holiday. Imagine USA having Australia where they could just say, well, you can come here for a holiday, go to the Great Barrier Reef, go to see all the dangers of the Northern Territory, you know, um, see some of the biggest deserts in the world. The biggest deserts won't be a tourist attraction, but they'll be a great place for them to train their military, and they would be able to control our economy. And we, of course, have all the mining, and it would mean that they would have more control over our mining, and we would be producing uranium for USA, and they would have more nukes more quickly. We have a huge uranium supply. I think it rivals Russia's. I think we're the two biggest in the world, Russia and Australia. And of course, the difference is that Russia produce their own, while we produce uranium for USA. If China took over Australia, USA would be terrified that China would start having a big nuclear stockpile. That would be their fear. And I think that might be why USA might want to get involved. But if Indonesia did, it's just going to be for the land because Indonesia's got a lot of people. I don't think China wants our uranium, but you never know. If they ended up being close friends with Russia, then they might. Um, but yeah, so I think that, and going back to this whole thing, USA, their picks, I think it'll help keep Trump safe, and I think that'll help the world to keep safe. So it is really important that he has picked people who are going to be loyal to him, who are going to be useful to him, who are going to be helpful. Now, of the three scenarios, who do I think will conquer Australia and win? The way things are going, and if we continue to keep this balancing act just right, um, I think China was more likely to take over Australia. Um, and I think that having China take over Australia is the best of the three options because if USA took over Australia, I think you'd see USA amass all of the nuclear stockpile, which would excite Russia into a nuclear war, and then the world is destroyed. Well, if China do, I don't think China's going to want our nukes, we don't have nukes, but our uranium. They're going to want our land, and because China has such a long history with Australia, going back to the 1830s, so that's over 200 years now. Most of our colonial history. Um, there's so many Chinese people living in Australia. There's millions of them. And we're so friendly with China. in every respect except for when USA tells us we're not allowed to be. And we have a more of a genuine alliance with China, even though I'm saying they're one of our three enemies. Uh, our alliance with China is much more genuine than our alliance with USA. Our alliance with USA is based on fear. We have at least a little bit of an economic, well, more than a little bit, quite a big economic relationship with China and a friendship with them. And I think that a transition to Australia under Chinese control, other than the language issues, would be quite easy. Now, if that were to happen, what I imagine happening is that eventually we would end up with 100 million Chinese people living in Australia. So our population would explode. And I think it would get up that high. But they would probably mostly live in areas where nobody lives. And they'd have little Chinese communities living in the middle of the desert. And I think they'll fail. So I think that a lot of that won't work the way that they think it will. And I don't think they'll be able to really establish footholds in our big cities. There might be some smaller city, maybe Townsville, Mackay sort of thing in rural Queensland where they could establish a little bit. But I think you'll find that they won't be able to put as many Chinese in Australia as they think they can. They could put a few, maybe 10 million, but I think they'll try for 100 and I think they will get 100, but I think they'll fail long term. And I think you'll find that if they do it too harsh, we will rebel and we'll fight back and we'll take it back. So I think that they'll have to do it quite casually. And I think long term, it'll essentially we'll still be running ourselves, but instead of having UK as our overlord, we'll have China. So we'll still have our own prime minister. We'll still speak our own language, but we'll just have Chinese languages as preference. So Mandarin, Cantonese, and whatever else. And so the difference between that and a USA situation was that if USA take us over, I think that we would be very warlike, and it would promote a global world war. And so I think that that's a much scarier option, not just for Australians, but for the world. So and again, as I said, I don't think that Indonesia conquering Australia is a long-term strategy. I think they could defeat Australia 50-50, but they couldn't hold Australia. And I don't think they would hold it for any length of time. Both China and USA could hold Australia for a long time. Um, I think 100 years would be quite conceivable for both, maybe even longer than that. And China would be more easily able to hold Australia because China's closer and we have that historical friendship. Whilst USA are further away, and we had nothing to do with USA until fairly recently, and it's always been very one-sided. And so I think you'll find that if USA did take over Australia, Australians would be a lot more hostile to it than they would be if China did. And I think you'd find that whilst USA would still be able to control us, they would have to be doing it in a very nasty way, which would be very detrimental to us. Plus, of course, there would be the nuclear stockpiling and all of the rest. And I think that you would find that USA doing that would look really bad in the eyes of the world and would make them look terrible. In fact, they'd be better off to conquer South America than to conquer Australia, or conquer Mexico and then South America. I think a lot of people say USA may as well conquer Mexico and Canada at least, but may as well also take South America. They have the military power to do that, and that makes more sense than invading Australia. Australia, it only makes sense to America for our uranium and our raw supplies. Well, plus also as a holiday destination, but mainly for the military aspect. And that's a scary reason to invade someone who's still we're being friendly with them. So I think that Donald Trump, with all this, is hopefully going to turn around some of these big mistakes that Joe Biden made in Ukraine. Now, I'm hoping that the war in Ukraine completely ends within a year. Like, no remnants, nothing, friendship, everybody shaking hands. I don't really need it to be done in a day, but he did promise a day, so I want him to keep his promise. And I think a lot of these people, I've heard a speech by Tulsi Gabbard, and she's saying, yeah, he'll end it in a day. And she's mentioned Facebook and Twitter. She's mentioned some of the lying about him. And we know that that led to two assassination attempts. And we need to, I know that politicians lie, but there's certain levels which it's a bit much. And, when you're having somebody saying things and they're being fact checked. Now, look, by all means, fact check him afterwards and say, hang on, he lied about those eating cats things. Fair enough, do that. Even have the other person say, no, that's not true. They weren't eating cats. But don't have the mediator doing it. Don't have the reporter doing it. That sort of stuff is rad. And this is another thing with the fact checking. Now, I always used to use Snopes, but I don't use it anymore because I don't, you know, I'm not against it. But I think that the problem is when they come in and you write something that you know is true, like I'm speaking the truth here, and then somebody puts a fact check on there, and you're like, particularly when it comes up automatically. It's like, really? I used to fact check people all the time, and I'd say, "Oh, actually, I think that's just a scam." And that's one thing. You go to these places and you fact check it yourself. We don't need this done by ourselves. We're not babies. And it's not just the babying, but it's also very cruel and very manipulative. The whole Hunter Biden thing, and we know that that wasn't fraud. That was election interference by not letting us speak about it. That should be a lesson for why this fact checking is so bad. So we really have to be careful about that. Yes, politicians lie all the time, and it's a good thing if journalists later on write, "Da, da, 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 that was a complete lie." Yeah, you should be doing that. But don't do it in the middle of the debate. Let them say their piece and then do it. You know? And I often say to people, like, what is the danger of conspiracy theories? None. What is the danger of misinformation? There's a huge danger. But misinformation doesn't come from me. It comes from the politicians. Well, mostly the politicians. You have to have that platform of believability, otherwise it's not misinformation. Disinformation comes from the politicians. They say, well, we've got to combat misinformation with official reports. No, 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 no. The misinformation comes from the official reports. And not all of them. Most official reports are correct, but some of them are not. Conspiracy theories are aimed at stopping the misinformation. Now, sometimes conspiracy theories are wrong too, but conspiracy theories are harmless. Misinformation is dangerous. But what you're saying is misinformation is not misinformation. If it's coming from someone on YouTube, it's not misinformation. If it's coming from Joe Biden and it's wrong, it probably is misinformation. If it's coming from Donald Trump and it's wrong, it probably is misinformation. And that can be dangerous. But not because he's Donald Trump, not because he's worse than Joe Biden's good, because he's of his power level. You need that power level to have the misinformation. Otherwise, it's not misinformation. Because you need to be believable. I'm not believable. I'm just a person. You know. And if you're believing people on YouTube, I mean, if you believe them because they make sense, fair enough. But where's the qualification? Yeah. I've said enough on that. I think he's done a great job with the picks. I don't even know who picked in 2016. I don't know who Joe Biden picked. I didn't care. But these ones make sense. I don't know if they'll work out, but I know at the bare minimum he's going to have loyalty. He's going to have people on his side. And if that means we can end the war in Ukraine, now that's the most important thing. I know people worry about the war in Israel. It's not as important. There's no nukes there. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not as important. The world isn't going to end if Israel keeps fighting with Iran or Lebanon or whoever. The world could end if Russia keep fighting with with Ukraine. It could. And I really do hope that he ends that war. And I hope he ends it before it gets worse. I hope at the very minimum, very quickly, he eases those things. And I also hope that the thing that Joe Biden did yesterday, I think, that it doesn't escalate things and that it is able to be wound back. And I hope that Ukraine don't never get those missiles and never use them. If they do get them, that they never use them and blah, blah, blah. there's but look, I really don't think that that will escalate things. I mean, if you're thinking you're Vladimir Putin, you're going to say, well, it's going to be a month and a half, and you'll get to undo that. And if I was him, I'd be meeting with Trump, not Biden. I'd be meeting with Trump and saying, hey, mate, are you going to wind them back? And if I was Trump, I'd say, yeah, I will, but I want something from you. And he's going to say, no, I'm giving you nothing. You do that, or we're at war. Mm, I'd be meeting him straight away. I might invite Biden, but I'd be meeting with Trump first if I was Putin. And yeah, look, yeah, Trump would have to be a moron for that to lead to anything. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. But yeah, I certainly think, yeah, again, great pick so far. Just the idea of it is great. That he's not picking who he's been told to pick. He's picking people who he wants to pick. That's the way every government should be run. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.